Hey everybody, and welcome to this deep dive. Sometimes it feels like you're just kind of stuck. Like you're going through the motions, repeating the same mistakes, even when you're really trying to change. Well, today we're going to tackle that feeling head on. We're diving into the world of toxic patterns and habits, and how to break free from them. And to guide us on this journey, we're turning to a podcast that really resonated with me. It's called Self-Reflection for a Better You, Conquering Toxic Patterns and Habits. And it's hosted by a follower of Yahweh. So we'll be exploring this topic from a faith-based perspective, blending that spiritual wisdom with scientific insights, because let's face it, you can't solve a problem with the same mind that created it.
Right. So true. And this podcast really emphasizes that. Self-reflection is key. It's about looking at our lives honestly, even the messy parts,
Mhm.
through the lens of truth.
That reminds me of that verse in Psalms. It's Psalm 139.2324, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." I mean, inviting God into that process of self-reflection. That's powerful stuff, don't you think?
Absolutely. And what's amazing is that science actually backs this up. There's research from places like Harvard and the University of California showing that self-reflection isn't just some feel-good spiritual concept. It's actually key to rewiring our brains and breaking free from those negative patterns. It's like taking your brain to the gym.
I like that, taking your brain to the gym. Okay, so we've established that self-reflection is super important. But what are some of those toxic habits we need to be on the lookout for? The podcast host mentions a few that really resonated with me: procrastination, social media overload, and holding on to unforgiveness. Have you ever struggled with any of those?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Procrastination especially. And it's often more than just laziness. Research suggests that it can come from fear of failure, perfectionism, or even lack of self-belief. But from a faith perspective, it's interesting to think about how procrastination might actually hinder our ability to fulfill the purpose that God has for our lives.
That's a good point. When we put things off, it's almost like we're saying, I don't trust God's timing, or I don't think I can do, He's calling me to do. It's almost like a form of self-sabotage, isn't it?
Exactly. And the podcast host reminds us we're not meant to do this alone. Remember Philippians 4.13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. When we tap into that divine strength, we can overcome those fears and doubts that fuel procrastination.
Now let's talk about that social media monster in the room. I mean,
Hmm.
come on. Who hasn't fallen down that rabbit hole of endless scrolling, only to end up feeling worse about themselves afterward? The podcast talks about how social media can fuel comparison, envy, and distraction. And science totally backs this up.
Oh, yeah. There was this fascinating study done by the University of Pennsylvania. They had participants limit their social media use to just 30 minutes a day. And they saw significant decreases in anxiety and depression compared to the group that didn't limit their use. And they specifically looked at Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat for this study. It involved college students who were already reporting high levels of social media use. What makes this study so compelling is that it was a randomized controlled trial, which is considered like the gold standard in research. So it really gives us solid evidence for those negative mental health effects of too much social media.
That's eye-opening. It's like we're trading our mental and emotional well-being for fleeting likes and dopamine hits.
Yeah.
And those feelings of comparison and inadequacy can really mess with our sense of identity and purpose, don't you think?
It reminds me of the story of the prodigal son. In Luke 15, the younger son runs off, squanders all his inheritance, and ends up totally lost and alone. In a way, social media can be like that far country. It promises fulfillment, but often leaves us empty and disconnected from what really matters.
That's a great analogy. We're chasing after these external validations when true fulfillment comes from our relationship with God and living out His purpose for our lives.
Now, speaking of destructive patterns, another one the podcast tackles is unforgiveness. We've all been hurt by people, but holding on to those grudges creates bitterness and resentment that just poisons our hearts and minds. It's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die.
I've heard that saying before, and it's so true. It's like we're giving those past hurts the power to control our present and our future. The podcast host mentioned some research from the Mayo Clinic that links unforgiveness to some pretty serious health problems.
Right. Absolutely. Holding on to unforgiveness is linked to higher anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, and even heart problems. It's like carrying around a heavy weight all the time. And biblically speaking, it makes perfect sense. Ephesians 4.32 tells us, be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Forgiveness is ultimately about freeing ourselves from that prison of bitterness.
Forgiveness is a tough one, for sure. It's not about condoning what someone did, but about letting go of that anger and bitterness for all sake. I've experienced that freedom myself, and it's truly liberating.
It's so powerful. And I think it's important to remember that forgiveness is a process. It doesn't always happen overnight. It takes time and intentional effort. And sometimes we really need to lean on God's grace to help us let go.
I'm really curious to hear more about practical strategies for overcoming these toxic habits. What are your thoughts?
Well, the podcast has some really helpful tips. It blends spiritual wisdom with practical steps we can take. It's not just about feeling better, it's about becoming more like Christ. I'm ready
Yeah,
to dig into those if you are. It's encouraging how the podcast approaches these issues, with that balance of grace and accountability. It acknowledges the struggle, but it doesn't let us off the hook. It reminds us we have the power to make choices that align with our faith.
for sure. It's not about beating ourselves up. It's about recognizing where we fall short and inviting God into that transformation process. So what kind of practical steps does the podcast suggest for breaking free from these patterns?
Well, for procrastination, the host recommends something called time boxing. Have you heard of that? It's where you schedule specific blocks of time for tasks, even if it's just for like 15 minutes. It's a way to overcome that initial inertia and get the ball rolling.
I like that. It's like tricking your brain into getting started. It's like that saying, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Even those small, consistent actions can lead to big progress over time. And from a faith perspective, it's about surrendering our plans to God's will, trusting that He'll equip us for the tasks He's called us to do.
Exactly. And speaking of small steps, when it comes to taming that social media beast, the podcast suggests setting boundaries. Remember that University of Pennsylvania study? They found that limiting social media to just 30 minutes a day made a big difference for people's mental well-being.
I've tried that myself. And it's crazy how much mental space it freed up. It's like decluttering your mind, making room for more meaningful things. The podcast also suggests replacing that scroll time with something more spirit-nourishing, like reading scripture, spending time in nature, or connecting with loved ones. What are some things you do to disconnect from the digital world and recharge your spiritual batteries?
I've found that taking a digital Sabbath once a week is so helpful. Just a day where I completely unplug from all devices and just focus on being present. Sometimes I go for a hike, spend time with family, or just curl up with a good book. It's amazing how much more refreshed and connected I feel afterward.
I love that idea. It's like giving your mind and soul permission to breathe. It's a beautiful way to honor that Sabbath principle of rest and reconnecting with God. It's a reminder that our worth and identity aren't tied to how many likes we get, but to our relationship with our Creator.
Beautifully said. Now, let's not forget about forgiveness. This one can be tough, but the podcast offers a really helpful perspective. It's about recognizing that forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was okay. It's about freeing ourselves from that burden of bitterness and resentment.
So important to remember. Holding on to unforgiveness is like letting someone live rent-free in your head. And as we talked about earlier, it can really impact our physical and emotional health.
The podcast suggests a few practical steps for cultivating forgiveness. One that really resonated with me was the idea of praying for the person who hurt you. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but it can really shift our perspective and soften our hearts.
That's a powerful suggestion. It reminds me of Romans 12:20, which says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, those burning coals aren't about revenge. They represent the transformative power of kindness and compassion, overcoming evil with good.
It's about breaking that cycle of hurt and choosing to respond with love, even when it's hard. And sometimes forgiveness isn't about reconciliation with the other person. Sometimes it's about releasing ourselves from the pain of the past so we can move forward in freedom and healing.
This has been so insightful. It's like we're peeling back the layers of these toxic habits and uncovering a path towards lasting change. But I have to admit, it can feel a bit overwhelming at times. Where do we even begin?
That's a great question. The podcast emphasizes starting small, focus on one habit at a time, set realistic goals, and celebrate those small victories along the way. And most importantly, remember that we're not alone in this journey.
It's funny how we try to muscle our way through change, relying on our own strength when we have access to a limitless source of power through our relationship with God. It's like trying to climb a mountain with a backpack full of rocks when we could be soaring on eagle's wings.
What a great analogy. It really captures the essence of what we're talking about. It's about surrendering our burdens to God, trusting in His grace, and letting Him work in and through us.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. Now I'm feeling inspired, ready to tackle those toxic habits. But I'm sure our listeners are wondering, how do we actually apply all this wisdom to our own lives?
That's what we're going to cover next. The podcast has some great insights on personalizing these principles and creating a roadmap for lasting change. I'm excited to share them.
Okay, so we've talked about these toxic habits, procrastination, social media overload, holding on to unforgiveness, and how they can really trip us up. But how do we actually make lasting changes? You know, put all this wisdom into practice.
Well, the podcast really emphasizes the power of prayer and surrender. It's about recognizing that we can't do this alone. We need to invite God into the process. It reminds me of that verse in 2 Corinthians 12:9. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. So we're actually stronger when we acknowledge our weaknesses and rely on God's strength.
It's like admitting we can't do it all on our own, but with God's help, all things become possible. So instead of trying to force change through sheer willpower, we lean into His grace and strength.
Exactly. And on a practical level, the podcast suggests starting with small, achievable goals. Don't try to change everything overnight. Focus on one habit at a time. Like if social media is your struggle, maybe start by setting a 30-minute daily limit. Or try having certain times of the day as tech-free zones.
I like the tech-free zones. It's like creating a little sanctuary for your mind and soul. And for procrastination, maybe it's breaking down a big task into smaller, more manageable chunks, or using that time boxing technique we talked about.
Right. And with forgiveness, maybe start by just praying for the person who hurt you. It's not about condoning what they did, but it can help to soften your heart and open up the possibility of healing.
It's amazing how these principles apply to so many areas of life. It's not just about breaking bad habits. It's about growing closer to God and living a life that reflects His purpose for us.
Absolutely. The podcast uses this analogy of a garden. Just like a garden needs tending, our hearts and minds need care and attention, weeding out those negative thoughts and behaviors, and cultivating those that bear good fruit.
I love that image. It makes me think of Galatians 5.22223, where it talks about the fruit of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. When we let God work in us, those qualities start to blossom.
It's like we're trading those toxic weeds for a garden full of life and beauty. And the process of growth can be messy and uncomfortable. There'll be times when we fall back into old patterns, we mess up, but that's okay. It's part of the journey.
It's like learning to ride a bike. You're going to fall a few times,
Yeah.
but you get back up, dust yourself off, and keep going. And we can always trust that God is right there with us, cheering us on every step of the way.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I love how the podcast brings together biblical wisdom and practical strategies. It's a powerful reminder that real change is possible when we partner with God.
Absolutely. It's not about being perfect, but about making progress. Not about doing it all ourselves, but about relying on God's grace. And remember, even those small steps in the right direction can lead to amazing transformations over time. So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this question. Well, what's one small step you can take today to start breaking free from a negative pattern in your life? Maybe it's setting a time limit for social media. Maybe it's spending 15 minutes in prayer. Or maybe it's reaching out to someone you need to forgive. Whatever it is, remember, you're not alone in this journey. We're here for you. And most importantly, God is with you every step of the way. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's encouraged you and inspired you to keep growing and keep shining your light. Until next time, keep seeking truth and keep pressing on.